There are moments in a life so ordinary they feel almost cruel in their plainness. A cold bus seat, a fogged window, a woman and her dog returning home through the kind of November dark that presses against the glass like it wants in. Maravos had spent 11 years learning how to read threat from the particular way a room goes quiet, and now she sat on the 947 Cascade Transit Express with a retired military working dog named Ghost pressed against her left knee, pretending, as she had been pretending for 8 months, that she was just a woman going home. She was not just a woman going home. She was a former naval special warfare operator with 4 deployments, a left shoulder rebuilt twice by surgeons who had eventually given up trying to explain the limits of scar tissue to a person constitutionally incapable of respecting limits, and a grief so dense and private it had calcified somewhere between her sternum and her spine into something that felt, on bad days, like a second skeleton. The deployment photo was in her breast pocket, folded twice and softened to cloth at the creases, a thing she would not name aloud on most days. Ghost knew where it was. Ghost always knew. What Mara did not know, settling into the vinyl seat, while rain dragged itself sideways across the bus windows, and the highway, unreeled ahead like a dark ribbon dropped without care, was that the next 17 minutes would become the beginning of the longest reckoning of her life. She would find something wounded in that dark. She would make a choice the way you make the only choice available to a person whose entire formation has been about protecting the thing in front of you. And that choice would pull a thread that unraveled something enormous, something ugly, something that several very confident men had buried with great care and considerable resources. The dog saw it first. She trusted the dog. Ghost had been a SEAL team, working dog before a shrapnel injury to his right flank retired him into Mara's custody 14 months ago, which was another way of saying that the Navy had given her the one creature on Earth who missed the work as much as she did, and expressed it with the same economy of language, which was to say, almost none at all. He was a Belgian Malinois, 71 pounds, the color of dead leaves and autumn shadow, and he had a professional's contempt for wasted motion. He did not bark unless there was something worth barking at. He had not barked in 11 days. Mara had been counting, because counting was how she kept the second skeleton from speaking. She counted Ghost's water intake, and the hours since his last meal, and the number of days since she had spoken to someone who was not a cashier or a dispatcher or the man at the VA who kept rescheduling her appointment. She counted the days since the deployment photo had come out of her breast pocket, for any reason other than transfer from one set of clothes to another. The number was high. She knew the number was high. She kept counting instead of doing anything about it, because counting was exact, and feelings were not, and in the hierarchy of things she trusted, exactness ranked very near the top. The bus had 13 passengers when it left the Cascade Junction terminal at 9:47, which Mara noted as a habit rather than a necessity. Scanning faces the way that never fully stops once you have been trained into it. The way a smoke alarm never stops smelling for smoke. She catalogued positions and postures, the geometry of who was watching what and why. 2 older women near the front balanced shopping bags on their laps like standards carried into some domestic battle long since concluded. A teenager with headphones let his foot tap a syncopated private rhythm against the floor. A man in a construction vest slept with his chin on his chest, his breathing in the slow, open-mouthed kind that said genuinely unconscious rather than performing sleep. A woman nursed an infant under a blanket with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to make herself small in public space. 3 young men in the back rows arranged themselves in the studied looseness of people performing relaxation. The performed kind, which was its own form of tension. Mara had learned to read the way a sailor reads a sky, not at what was present, but at what was being signaled beneath it. She looked once, measured what she found, and looked away, because she was not on duty, and Ghost was warm against her knee, and the rain was doing what November rain does in the Cascades, and she was going home. The thing about going home when home is a rented room above a hardware store in a town of 4,000 people, where you know no one, and have refused every invitation, and keep the curtains closed, is that the word carries an enormous amount of freight on very little structural support. Mara's room had a wood stove. She had been required to source the stovepipe for herself. A cot that was newer than it looked, a hand-drawn topographic map of the surrounding 20 miles of national forest pinned above the desk, and 3 photographs on the wall, which was 3 more than she needed, and 3 fewer than a therapist might have recommended. One showed the team, one showed a shoreline she had not returned to, one she would not discuss. Ghost's bed was better than hers, and she had built it from a cedar pallet and a cut of memory foam and a fleece liner she replaced when it wore thin. This was not indulgence, it was operational necessity. A dog who slept well, worked well. She told herself this regularly, and mostly believed it, which was better than the alternative, which was to admit that she had built it with care, because care was easier to direct at a dog than at herself, and because the dog had never once made her feel foolish for it. The shift came at 9:53, 6 minutes into the route, somewhere in the long, wooded corridor between the highway junction and the Ridgemore service exit, where the road curved away from all artificial light, and the timber pressed in on both sides, and the rain had moved from lateral to nearly horizontal. Ghost's ears rotated, not the full pivot of alert. That was its own language, a vocabulary of small, angular degrees she had spent 14 months learning to read. Just a fractional movement, like a dial turned 1 notch from standby toward receiving. She catalogued it and held still. The 3 men in the back had stopped performing looseness. That was the word. Stopped. The way a performance stops when the performer remembers something more important than the audience. The teenager's foot had gone still. The construction vest man had not moved, but his breathing had changed in a way she had not been consciously tracking until the change arrived, because that was how her auditory field worked. It received weather without asking permission, and now the weather had shifted. She stayed facing forward. She listened. The exchange started behind her in the low, deliberate register that carries threat as efficiently as any shout. The particular frequency of men who have decided and are now only managing logistics. She heard the older women at the front of the bus make a sound that was not a word. She heard the driver make a sound that was. It was a short word, and it was frightened. Ghost pressed harder against her knee. He was awake. He had probably been awake for 2 minutes before his ears moved, because that was the kind of dog he was. The kind who gathered information completely before signaling, which was, she thought, briefly, and with some recognition, also the kind of woman she was. She placed her right hand flat on her thigh and felt the absence of what she was not carrying, because she was going home on a bus in November and had made a deliberate decision not to carry it everywhere, because a therapist she had seen twice before the appointment system broke down had said something about the difference between readiness and vigilance, and she was now revisiting that observation with significant skepticism. She thought of the deployment photo against her sternum. She thought about the last time she had been in a confined space with people who had decided, and what happened to things caught in confined spaces when the deciding was done. She breathed once, twice, the way she had been taught to breathe before a problem. Slowly, and from the bottom of the lungs, filling from the base upward. And Ghost felt her breathe and adjusted his own rhythm to match, which was still the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed, and which she thought about on the nights the second skeleton was loudest. Then she stood up. She did it the way she did most things she had decided to do, which was without announcement, and without hesitation, and without any performance of the authority behind it, because the authority was not performance. It had been pressed into her through 11 years and 4 deployments and the specific education of carrying responsibility for the people around you in places where responsibility had consequences measured in bodies. She stood, and Ghost stood beside her, and she turned, and the rear of the bus resolved into the clean geometry of a problem. 3 men, 2 standing in the aisle, 1 braced at the emergency exit. The nearer one held a folding knife in the easy grip of someone who had used the presence of it to produce results before, and expected the same yield tonight. The driver had been told to keep driving. Everyone else had been told to be still. The infant was sleeping under the blanket. Mara was grateful for this, without the bandwidth to feel gratitude completely in the moment. The way you can be aware of the weather while running through it. She said 4 words. She said them in a voice without temperature, which is sometimes more frightening than volume. The voice of someone who has already processed every available outcome and is speaking from the far side of that processing. She said them to produce one result, which was hesitation, because hesitation is what you need when you are alone in an aisle with a dog and 3 men who have decided, and you need the hesitation to restructure the deciding. The man with the knife looked at her, and then looked at Ghost, and she watched the calculation happen in real time, the way you watch weather change in the mountains in summer, fast and total. Ghost was not snarling. He was not lunging. He was standing with his full 71 pounds absolutely motionless, his eyes on the knife with the particular quality of attention that carries no performance whatsoever, only purpose. This is more frightening than snarling. Snarling is a door with a warning sign. This was a door with nothing on it at all. She gave them the structure of a choice, not a threat, a structure. The structure was this: the knife goes on the seat. Everyone sits down, and no one's evening ends in a way they will enjoy describing afterward. She was direct about what she was: military working dog, trained, handler. She said she would very much prefer that no one required a demonstration, and she meant it, because demonstration meant Ghost at risk, and Ghost was the one thing in her life she was not prepared to negotiate risk on. Which made her simultaneously the calmest and the most dangerous person in that bus at 9:53 on a November night in the Cascades. The man at the emergency exit lunged toward the front of the bus. She let him go 3 steps, measuring the geometry without looking like she was measuring it, and then she placed herself in his path and ended his momentum with the brisk, professional economy of someone who has done this in the dark, in the rain, in conditions that made a bus aisle feel like a ballroom. He sat down heavily. The man with the knife set it on the seat. The 3rd man pressed his hands flat against the back of the row in front of him. Ghost had not moved. She was deeply proud of him and would tell him so later, in the specific private way. She told him things which involved the base of his left ear, and no unnecessary words. What followed took 11 minutes, which she also counted. The driver had already called dispatch. 2 highway patrol cruisers arrived at the Ridgemore exit, like something the November dark had been holding for this exact use, their lights painting the rain red and blue in a way that was briefly beautiful. If you were at the correct remove for beauty, which Mara was not yet because she was still managing the space, keeping the geometry clean, keeping Ghost close, keeping her breathing in the long, slow pattern that also regulated his. The 3 men went into the cruisers. The bus stood at the exit in the rain while statements were taken, and the driver said something to her she did not retain, and the nursing mother wrapped the sleeping infant tighter and looked at Mara with an expression Mara received and did not know what to do with, which was an expression of uncomplicated gratitude, the kind that assumes you understand its full weight without translation. She looked at Ghost instead. He was watching the timberline. He had been watching it since the cruisers arrived, and she trusted that more than she trusted the cleared aisle behind her, because Ghost did not watch trees without a reason. Something was in the trees. She could feel it the way she had learned to feel incoming things. Not in the front of her mind where analysis lived, but in the back of it, where older knowledge accumulated. The bus drove on without her. She told the highway patrol officer she was staying. He looked at her, and at Ghost, and at the quality of her standing in the rain, with no umbrella, and no evident concern about the rain, and he made a quick calculation about the usefulness of arguing, and did not argue. He gave her his card, asked her to call if the walk became a problem, and she said it would not, and he drove east, and she turned to the timberline and listened. Ghost was already moving. He moved along the ditch at the edge of the road, with his nose reading the ground ahead of him, and she moved with him, because moving with Ghost in this register was not a decision. It was a conjugation. They were one thing operating in distributed form, and the one thing was moving toward the dark between the trees. The rain had dropped to a fine mist that touched the face like cold breath and gathered in the collar and ran down the back of the neck without asking. The highway sounds withdrew behind them. The trees thickened, and the ground softened, and the smell of wet bark and decomposing needles rose up around her like the forest, asserting its terms. Her boots found the soft earth at the tree line, and she stepped in. She heard it before she saw it. In 11 years of working in darkness, she had developed an auditory field that was, she was told once by a colleague, who meant it as a compliment, slightly disturbing in its acuity. What she heard was breathing, working too hard, and movement trying to stop itself, the precise sound of a large animal in extreme distress, doing everything it could to go quiet, because loud things in the dark die, and the animal knew this at the cellular level, the way prey animals carry that knowledge not in thought, but in architecture. Ghost stopped 6 feet ahead and looked back over his shoulder, with the expression she had learned to read, as here, now, and careful. She moved to him, and crouched, and looked. And what was in the gap between two root masses at the base of a Douglas fir was a doe, a large one, a whitetail, 5 years old from her markings, held by a trap that was not a legal trap. The leg hold configuration was the kind that had been banned in this state for 11 years, and it was currently doing something to the doe's left foreleg that Mara did not look at twice before she was already running the problem, because looking twice was for situations where you had time to react, and she had already reacted, and now she was managing. The doe's eyes were white-ringed with panic, and her sides heaved with the particular helplessness of a body fighting restraint, and losing and fighting it anyway, because the body does not know how to stop trying. She was making a sound low in her throat. That was not a sound prey animals make unless everything else has failed, and the sound went into Mara's chest like a key into a lock, and what it opened she could not have named at that precise moment, and would name later. There were 3 fawns. This was October late for fawns to still be following a doe, which meant they were late-season births, which meant they were small, which meant they were cold and becoming colder. 2 were pressed against the doe's flank, trembling in the light mist. The third was 10 feet back in the dark, with its legs folded under it, in the way that said it had been there for some time. Not an hour, not half an hour, longer. She counted them. She always counted. 3, 2 viable in the immediate sense, 1 requiring immediate intervention. She went to the isolated one first, because isolation in the cold dark is the first problem you solve, before the source of the warmth, before the comfort, before anything. She moved toward it with everything reduced. Voice dropped below the threshold of threat, a low, continuous murmur that was less words than rhythm, a sound that said, I am here, and I am not pursuing, and I am not loud, and I have not decided anything bad. Ghost held back without being told. He knew the protocol. He had been trained by people who understood that an animal who trusts you because you have not startled it is more tractable than an animal who trusts you because it has run out of choices. This was also true of people. She had thought this in many dark places. She thought it again now, crouching in the wet roots, her knee soaking through her pants, her hands slow and open. She got her coat off and wrapped the smallest fawn, and she held it against her chest and felt its heartbeat, which was rapid and light and present, and something in her sternum unlocked with the quiet certainty of a mechanism that had been engaged for a very long time, finally finding the correct key. She did not name what unlocked. She would name it later. She stood with the fawn against her chest and looked at the doe and the trap and let herself think, briefly and coldly, about the kind of man who sets this device in the dark on public forest land in a national protection corridor, and whether his reason was sport or signal or the economics of keeping a boundary clear of the things that draw attention to it. She thought all of this in approximately 4 seconds, and then she stopped thinking about the man and thought only about the animal in front of her, because the animal in front of her was alive, and the man was not here, and the choice was not complicated. It was simply the only available choice for a person formed the way she had been formed, which was around the irreducible fact that you protect the thing in front of you. She called emergency dispatch from the cell coverage that flickered at the tree line and gave her coordinates precisely from the application. She kept always active, and she said she needed a wildlife rehabilitation contact immediately, and the dispatcher was calm and efficient, and the number connected on the third ring to a voice that was neither calm nor efficient in its surface manner, but was awake and purposeful, and clearly used to being woken for exactly this. The voice belonged to Dr. Celestine Park, who turned out to be a large animal and wildlife veterinarian, operating a licensed rehabilitation facility 9 miles north, which Mara would learn later was not serendipity, but was the specific result of 11 years of Celestine fighting to get that license for exactly this corridor. A fight she described afterward, once, as Byzantine, expensive, and worth every inch of the argument. On the phone at nearly midnight in November, Dr. Park's voice was the voice of someone who had climbed out of sleep into a problem and was already 3 steps into solving it before fully upright. She asked the right questions in the right order. She did not ask unnecessary ones. Mara respected this immediately and without reservation, the way she respected all competence that announced itself through action rather than explanation. She answered each question with the precision of someone who has learned that accurate reporting is not detail for its own sake. It is what the person on the other end needs to save a life. Celestine said she was coming and told Mara what not to do with the trap and what to do with the fawn and how to keep the doe from compounding the foreleg injury until she arrived. And Mara received each instruction and executed each one while standing in the cold mist with the fawn against her chest and Ghost at the perimeter doing what Ghost did in dark spaces he was not certain of, which was watch everything and emit his judgment about it in silence. The 9 miles took Celestine 23 minutes in a truck she ran with the heating system only partially functional, which Mara would learn about later and which explained the extensive blanket infrastructure in the cab. Ghost made room without being asked. He had decided Celestine was trustworthy before the truck finished stopping, which Mara registered as significant. Ghost's judgments were not social performances, they were assessments, and they had a better record than most human evaluations she had observed. What Dr. Park did to that trap in the first 40 seconds of her arrival was remove it with a speed and authority that said she had done this before. Too many times, with bolt cutters she kept in the truck bed as a matter of course, the way someone keeps an object that has become a regular professional tool rather than an emergency one. The doe surged against the release, and Celestine held her with a forearm built by decades of large animal practice, and she spoke to the animal in Korean and English in alternating streams, and the words themselves were not the point. It was the current beneath them, which was warm and steady and entirely honest, and the doe went still enough to treat. Mara held the smallest fawn and kept the other 2 contained in the crook of her arm, and Ghost sat at the perimeter doing what he had been doing since they arrived, which was watching the dark for the shape of someone returning to check a trap and finding instead 3 women and a dog. Nobody came. Ghost stayed watchful anyway. Celestine's facility was 9 miles of gravel road with 2 creek fords that had flooded to the axles in the recent rain, and the truck had made them with the controlled violence of a vehicle that had made them many times before and trusted its own record. The doe lay on the padded pallet in the bed, Mara beside her, the three fawns distributed between them in the graduated warmth of two sets of hands and 3 layers of Celestine's cab blankets. Ghost rode up front in the passenger seat with the quiet authority of someone who had decided the seat was his and had made his peace with the incomplete heating. The foreleg injury was significant, but the bone was intact. Celestine confirmed this with hands that read bone the way a geologist reads strata, through pressure and angle and the specific quality of what gives and what does not. 6 to 8 weeks of managed recovery for the doe. The smallest fawn would need more. The math of the living against the injured was better than it had been under the Douglas fir, and Mara was still running it because math was solid, and outcomes were not always, and she had learned in places she would not describe, that you hold the math until the outcomes confirm it, and only then, and not one moment before. By 3 in the morning the doe was sedated in a large enclosed recovery stall, banked with dry straw, the 2 stronger fawns stable in an adjacent pen, where they could hear and smell their mother through the slotted partition. And the smallest was in a warming box Celestine had built herself from an insulated plywood chest and an adjustable heat lamp, which she had named, with the dry humor of someone who maintains humor as a dedicated survival tool, rather than an ornament, the Situation Room. The smallest fawn's breathing had regularized to the slow rhythm of an animal returned from the edge. Mara watched it for longer than was strictly necessary before she allowed herself to sit on the stool in the corner of the stall, with Ghost's head on her boot, which was where he went when she had been on her feet too long, and he had decided the question was no longer open to negotiation. She sat. Celestine brought coffee from a machine that had been accumulating hard use since the previous decade, and whose output was not good coffee in any technical sense, but was hot, and Mara drank it without commentary, which Celestine received as the compliment it was. They talked around the most important fact in the room for 20 minutes, the way 2 people talk around a weight when they have each decided independently to take the measure of the other before approaching it directly. Celestine talked about the facility's caseload. 31 animals currently in care, 18 of them wildlife, the remainder domestic and agricultural rescues from 3 counties whose infrastructure for such work ranged from inadequate to effectively absent. She described a black bear from the southern end of the corridor who had arrived in August with a fishing line embedded 3 inches into the tissue of her left paw, and the 6 weeks it had taken to bring her back, and the morning she was released and walked into the timber without looking back, which Celestine described with a particularity that said she had needed the bear to look back, and had understood that needing that was about her, not about the bear. Mara understood this without saying so. She talked about Ghost's rehabilitation protocols and the specific challenges of transitioning a working military dog to non-operational life, which was a conversation she could conduct from entirely behind the wall of professional competence without opening any interior gate, and she conducted it that way, and Celestine received it that way, and neither of them commented on the wall. Then Celestine set her bad coffee down and said it plainly. That trap was the 4th she had pulled in this corridor in 14 months. The first 3 had each been set within 200 meters of the same property boundary. That boundary was where the Alderman Creek Conservation Easement abutted Václav Property Holdings land. She had reported each of the first 3 to the County Wildlife Division. The last report had gone unanswered for 9 weeks. Mara said nothing for 4 seconds, which was the sound of something arriving. Then she asked whether the previous trap sites had been documented with GPS coordinates and photographs, because if they had, then they constituted a pattern, and a pattern was evidence, and evidence was different in kind from a complaint. She knew the difference from every mission debrief she had ever participated in. Celestine looked at her with an expression that was recalibration. The look of a person who has been fighting alone and has just heard the sound of another fighter arriving. She said yes, every coordinate, every photograph, every date, copies held in 3 separate locations, because she was not naive about what happened to single copies of inconvenient records when powerful local interests were involved. Mara nodded. She looked at the smallest fawn in the Situation Room and thought about what kind of man sets 4 traps in a protected corridor over 14 months, and whether 9 weeks of county silence on a documented report was incompetence or something more deliberate. She did not say the latter aloud. Conclusions stated before the evidence is complete are not conclusions. They are vulnerabilities. She held the thought instead, and it held heat, and she was still holding it when the November morning came through the facility's east window in the long, thin, gray light that says, "Not warmth yet, not today, but here is the evidence that dark is not permanent." Ghost lifted his head from her boot and looked at the window and looked at her, and she reached down and touched the base of his left ear. She told him he had done well. He received this with great dignity, and then stood and went to look at the fawn, which he examined from a respectful distance before returning to his position, apparently satisfied. The county wildlife officer who arrived at 9:15 was a man named Hector Funes, 16 years in the division, with the face of someone who has received bad news with reliable consistency for 16 years and has made the private decision to keep showing up anyway. This was, Mara thought, a form of courage that rarely gets named as such. He came alone in a green division truck with a thermos and a case binder and a manner that was not quite gruff, but was armored in a way she recognized immediately, because she wore similar armor. The armor of a person who has learned that caring produces exposure and who has not found a way to stop caring and so has become very competent at not appearing to. He looked at the doe's foreleg. He looked at the trap, now bagged, which Celestine had preserved with the instincts of someone who had been disbelieved before, and understood that the object was more persuasive than the account of it. He read Celestine's documentation, all 14 months of it. With the deliberate focus of a man encountering something he has been partly circling for a long time without a clear approach. He closed the binder. He looked at Mara. He asked how long she had been in the area. She told him 8 months. He asked what she had done before. She told him without elaboration. He processed this the way people process useful information when they are being economical about their reactions, adjusted something in his internal geometry, and nodded once. He said the name Vaslav Property Holdings himself, which mattered because she had not said it. He said it the way you say the name of a thing you have been circling for a long time, without a clear approach. With a caution that was not cowardice, but the specific caution of a man with 17 years remaining, until a pension that supported 4 people who understood that the difference between caution and cowardice was what you did when the approach finally became available. She did not say any of this to him. She let him speak. He said that Garrison Vaslav chaired the County Parks Advisory Board, had funded the new wing on the regional hospital, and had his name on the scholarship endowment at the community college. He said the Vaslav family had held this land for 40 years, and in those 40 years, there had been 5 substantiated wildlife violations on or adjacent to the Vaslav boundary, and not one had resulted in a fine. He had submitted 2 of the 5 reports himself, and had watched both of them encounter what he described, with a precision that was almost artful, as resistance at the administrative level, a phrase Mara translated without effort into its simpler equivalent. Ghost sat at her heel with the expression of a judge who has heard this kind of testimony before, and is withholding his ruling. Celestine refilled the bad coffee. Nobody said the word corruption yet, because they were not yet at the place in the evidence where the word could bear the weight it was being asked to carry. That word requires a foundation, and they were still laying the foundation, and they all understood this without discussing it, because they were each, in their separate and practiced ways, people who understood the relationship between evidence and language. What shifted the weight was what Celestine found an hour later, which was less a discovery than a confirmation of something she had been afraid to look at directly. In removing the trap the previous night, she had noticed a small, hard lump beneath the doe's matted fur along the right rear haunch, the area where the animal had been pressing repeatedly against the root mass. She had catalogued it provisionally as a cyst, and then examined it that morning with the facility's portable ultrasound unit, and identified it as a passive RFID tag of the type used in large-scale wildlife research programs, embedded subcutaneously in the standard manner of a registered study animal. This doe was tagged. She was part of an active study. The tag carried a study number. When Celestine ran that number through the state wildlife research database, it returned a habitat corridor study funded through a university partnership and administered through a state grant. A study that had been active for 3 years, whose principal investigator was listed as Dr. Amara Nkosi at a university in the eastern part of the state, and whose stated purpose was monitoring ungulate population health in protected corridor zones to support ongoing easement negotiations. This meant that someone with data, standing, and institutional authority had a legal and academic interest in this doe's survival, had been tracking this population for 3 years, and had been watching what happened to the animals in this corridor. And what had been happening included, at minimum, 4 illegal traps set in the study zone across 14 months. Mara looked at the tag number and looked at Celestine, and felt something settle in her chest with the particular weight of a thing in motion, finding a resting point. She said, "We call the investigator. We call Funes back in. We stop managing this at the edges, and bring it to the center." Celestine said she had tried the center before. Mara said, "You tried the county center. The study is a state program. The state center is different from the county center. Specifically from the county center that has a man named Garrison Vaclav on its advisory board." Celestine looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone adjusting a long-held calculation, and then she nodded, not the small nod of resignation, but the larger nod of someone who has been pushing against a door alone for years and has just felt another shoulder come alongside them. "They called Dr. Amara Nkosi at 11 that morning. She answered on the first ring, which was not coincidence. The doe's RFID tag had pinged a stationary location for 16 hours, and the study's automated protocol flagged any stationary reading exceeding 12 hours as a welfare alert. She had been trying to reach the county wildlife division since 7 in the morning and had been reaching voicemail. She knew the Vaclav land. She said this carefully, with the specificity of someone who knows the difference between what they know and what they can demonstrate. She had 3 years of movement data on 11 tagged animals in this corridor, and what that data showed, when you mapped it against property boundaries, was a consistent avoidance pattern that had emerged in the 2nd year of the study. A behavioral modification in the herd, consistent with repeated traumatic encounter near the Vaclav boundary. She had written this observation into the study's 2nd-year report. The state program officer had responded that the observation was noted and would be factored into the next administrative review cycle. Mara recognized this sentence as a different administrative level of the same resistance. She said nothing. Dr. Nkosi was coming in person, 6 hours away and coming regardless. And she said this in the voice of someone who has been waiting 14 months for this exact phone call, without knowing that was what she was doing. Celestine listened to this voice and looked at the opposite wall for a moment, with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but contained both at their borders. Then she looked at Mara and said, in a voice low and level and very careful, They killed 3 of my study animals in that corridor in the second year. 3 tagged deer found dead, injuries consistent with illegal trap and firearm. I filed the report. I know what was in it. I know what happened to it. And Mara said, I know, not dismissal, receipt. The acknowledgement of a woman who understands that grief preserved in silence becomes a different and heavier thing, and who was standing in the room where someone else's preserved grief was finally being breathed back into language. Ghost had found the surveillance before any of them reached the point of discussing additional visits to the property. Late afternoon, the light falling early under November cloud, and Ghost went still at the facility's perimeter fence, with the posture that said, human movement in the tree line. Directional, deliberate, not accidental. Mara went to the fence and looked without calling attention to her looking, and what she found was a gray double-cab pickup in the turnout where the Forest Service access road crossed the main road. 2 men inside, not moving. No reasonable explanation for 2 men in a double cab in a Forest Service turnout at 4:15 on a November afternoon, unless they were watching something at the terminus of their sight line, which was the rehabilitation facility's access gate. She photographed the truck and the plate in the low light without raising the camera above the fence line. She called Funes. He ran the plate and called back in 4 minutes. The truck was registered to a property management company incorporated in a state 5 time zones east. The parent company's registered agent was a law firm that had appeared in county property filings adjacent to the Vaclav family trust on 14 separate occasions in the past 8 years. This was not proof. It was the shape of proof, which she had learned across many debriefs was almost always what arrived first, ahead of the proof itself, like weather before weather. She photographed the men again at 4:40 when the light shifted and their faces were briefly clearer. They left at 4:43. Ghost watched them until the truck was fully out of sight, and then looked at her with the expression that said it was noted. At 9 that night, something threw a stone through the facility's front office window. The stone had a zip tie around it, and the zip tie held a folded piece of paper, and the paper said, in printed letters without decoration, some animals should stay lost. Mara stood in the broken glass in the dark, with Ghost at her heel, and held the paper by its edge and felt something cold and old move through her. The feeling that precedes a specific kind of clarity, the kind that has no room in it for doubt or hesitation or the noise of anything other than the work. She called Funes immediately. She called Celestine, who came from her apartment at the back of the facility, in boots and a barn coat, with a headlamp around her neck, and looked at the paper and the glass and the expression on Mara's face and said, "You know what this means?" Mara said, "Yes. It means they know we have the dough. It means they know about the tag. It means someone in the county division talked." Funes arrived within 30 minutes and bagged the paper and measured the window and walked the full perimeter with Mara and Ghost in the dark, his headlamp cutting through the mist in short methodical arcs. He said, "This means I need to call the state office. I need to call the game warden. I need to stop handling this at the county level." She said yes. He looked at her and said, in a voice quieter than any he had used since arriving, "I should have done this sooner." She said, "You're doing it now." It was the plainest mercy she could offer, and she meant it without qualification. Dr. Nkosi arrived at 2:17 in the morning with 6 hours of driving behind her, a laptop bag, 2 external hard drives, and the expression of someone who has been carrying a mountain and is finally in a room with people who can see its full dimensions. She was small and precise in her movements, and had the eyes of someone who had spent 3 years looking at data that described something terrible, and had been told each time she tried to show the shape of it that the shape was unclear, premature, beyond her scope, or best addressed in the next review cycle, which is the administrative language for be quiet and remain patient, and trust the people who are telling you to wait. She did not look like someone who trusted that anymore. She sat at Celestine's work table, under the fluorescent light, with Ghost 6 feet away, conducting his judicial observation, and she opened both hard drives, and she showed them 3 years of movement data, and behavioral avoidance mapping, and mortality records, and annual reports, and the full correspondence with the State Program Office, including read receipts and non-responses, and one response that had told her her methodology required peer review before the observation could be considered substantive. Beside this, she placed the RFID ping records of the 3 dead study animals in the 2 weeks before each of their deaths. The patterns were not ambiguous. The animals had been herded repeatedly and methodically toward a specific section of boundary over multiple days in each case, and then they had died there. The traps were not opportunistic. They were positioned in advance of the herding. This was coordinated. This was planned. Celestine set her coffee down and opened a drawer in the filing cabinet she had locked with a separate padlock, and removed a small digital audio recorder and placed it on the table. She said she had not played this for anyone because she had not trusted anyone enough until tonight, which was a statement that cost her something visible to say, and they all registered the cost. She pressed play. The recording was from 8 months prior, made in the parking lot of the county offices, the day she had gone to submit the 3rd report in person, when she had overheard a conversation near the staff entrance. The portion captured lasted 41 seconds. It contained a name spoken twice and a dollar amount spoken once, and the phrases "let it process," and "nobody's looking at that corridor anymore." The name was Václav. The dollar amount was not small. Mara listened to it once and looked at Funes, and he looked at the recorder, and his jaw moved, and he said, in a voice quieter than anything he had produced since arriving, "I'm calling the state attorney's office in the morning." He said it the way a man says a thing he should have said sooner, and has decided, at some specific interior moment, to stop measuring the cost of saying it. What followed was not spectacular. This was one of the things Mara had learned, that she wished she had learned earlier. Justice is not spectacular. Not. It is a document submitted, and a document received, and a case number assigned, and an agency notified, and a subpoena issued, and a deposition scheduled, and a postponement filed, and a second deposition, and a forensic review of financial records that takes 6 weeks longer than projected, and a property inspection contested by 3 separate legal motions, and a counter-challenge to the study data's admissibility, and a second counter-challenge, and a long, cold winter in which the doe healed in the recovery stall, and the fawns grew measurably week by week, and Ghost aged another increment into the dignified late career of a dog who had decided his current posting, while irregular, was acceptable, and he intended to maintain it. The state attorney's office moved carefully and moved consistently, and did not televise what they were doing, and did not comment to the regional paper when Garrison Václav announced a new endowment at the community college in a timing that was not coincidental. Funes filed his own corrected reports and requested a formal review of his prior submissions and their handling, which opened a parallel process that was slower still and painful in the specific way that internal reviews are painful. The pain of an institution examining the gap between what it claimed to be and what it demonstrably did. The administrative director resigned in February. He had a lawyer. The lawyer negotiated. The negotiation produced cooperation that was imperfect and partial, and still more useful than no cooperation, which is the form that cooperation most often takes when it finally arrives. Gary Torelli had managed trapping logistics for the Václav property for 3 years, and had carried what he knew about those 3 years in the particular posture of a man whose back is bowed under weight he chose to pick up and cannot figure out how to set down, and who has learned that carrying it is its own form of punishment. He had preserved, on a thumb drive in a waterproof case at the base of a trail marker at the northeast corner of the Václav property, a complete record of trap placement orders, dates, and internal communications, including 14 written directives bearing the identifiable language, if not the verifiable direct signature of the property's oversight authority. The electronic metadata on the directives was traceable. The state investigator's forensic accountant confirmed this in March. Gary turned the drive over in February through an attorney who had negotiated what Gary described as not a clean deal, because nothing in what he had done was clean, but an honest one, meaning accountability proportional to participation, and participation that was complete. He was required to set the weight down in testimony. It was harder than carrying it had been. He did it anyway. Mara heard about the testimony secondhand and felt about Gary Torelli what she felt about most things that were complicated and finally honest, which was something with no clean name, but which was not contempt. Dr. Nkosi's study data was formally admitted into the state wildlife enforcement record in March, which meant 3 years of meticulous, grieving, persistent work was now part of the official history, rather than a stack of documents in a locked drawer. This was not the same as restoring what had been lost. It was the closest the law could come to acknowledging that the loss had happened and had mattered. She drove back in March to see the doe and stood at the fence of the recovery area in the early spring light and watched without speaking for a long time, and then said, "She looks like she's thinking about something." Celestine said, "She always does. That's how I know she's going to be all right." Mara stood behind both of them with Ghost and said nothing and did not need to. Some moments are complete without addition. Garrison Václav did not stand trial that year. This is the truth, and it is unsatisfying, and it remains the truth. The family trust's attorneys were experienced, and the evidentiary chain, while substantial, required extensions the court granted twice. What happened instead was slower and grinding and legal and ultimately lasting. He resigned from the County Parks Advisory Board in April, describing the decision in a statement as a personal choice to focus on family priorities, which no one who understood the timeline believed, but which was nonetheless the language of the official record. The property management company dissolved in May. The law firm terminated its relationship with the Václav Trust in June, a sentence that read as bureaucratic in its surface and meant something specific and significant to the people watching the case, of whom Funes was one. And he called Mara when he received the notification and said, "It's moving." She said, "I know." He said, "Slow." She said, "Slow is real." There was a silence on the phone that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have done difficult work together and understand that the conversation doesn't always require more than what has already been said. Spring came to the Cascades the way it always does in that country, which is with enormous and somewhat reckless commitment. Everything opening at once after the long compression of winter, the snowmelt running the creek behind the facility over its banks for 5 days in April, and then retreating to leave the gravel bars scoured clean and silver bright, the timber releasing its smell in the warm afternoons in a way that entered the lungs and did something to the second skeleton that Mara had not anticipated. It made it lighter, not gone, lighter, which was different, and was enough. She had not stopped counting. But the counting had changed character. She counted what was living and healing more than what was absent. She had not solved the absence. She had reordered it, which was what Celestine had described one night in the facility office over the aging machine's bad coffee. "I used to think healing meant the grief went somewhere else. I think now it means the grief gets company." Mara had sat with this for a long time, and then had said, quietly, "Reyes would have liked this place." She had not said his name aloud in 8 months. Celestine had not asked who Reyes was, because she had understood, from the weight of the name, that she would be told in the right time, which was not tonight, and the right time was something she was willing to wait for. She received the name, and held it at a respectful distance, and Mara felt the receiving, and knew it was different from silence, which had been the only thing she had offered the name for 8 months. and she was grateful, in the unadorned way of someone who has been given something they did not know they needed until the moment it arrived. The dough was cleared for soft release on a morning in late April, when the temperature had been above freezing for 11 consecutive days, and the corridor study had resumed under a new, state-supervised protocol, with 4 additional sensor stations installed by the university team, and the fawns were large enough, and the smallest one, who had spent November and December in the Situation Room, and had come through the winter with a slight asymmetry in her hindquarters that Celestine described as cosmetic, and Ghost confirmed by sniffing it twice and walking away with the expression of a senior official finding it acceptable, had been moving on her own legs in the facility's soft-release enclosure for 3 weeks and was ready for the world. Mara did not attend the release. This was a decision, not an oversight. She had thought about it carefully and understood that going would have been about her, and not about the dough, and not about the fawns, and she had learned, across a considerable education in the matter, that the difference between service and need is whether you are present for the living thing or for the feeling the living thing produces in you. The living things did not need her there. They needed the tree line. Celestine sent 3 photographs by phone afterward. In the first, the doe stood at the open gate with her head up. In the second, she was at the tree line's edge. In the third, the forest had her completely, and there was only the gap where she had been, and the long morning light falling through it. Mara looked at all 3 photographs in her truck at the top of the ridge road, and then put her phone in her pocket and looked at Ghost and said out loud, plainly, without decoration, "We did okay." Ghost looked at the timberline. He was of the opinion that the assessment was accurate and required no elaboration. She stayed. This was not the plan, but plans are for the period before you discover what you are actually doing. She had come to this country as a temporary arrangement between one life and the next one. She could not yet see the shape of, and what the winter had shown her was that the next life was not in a different place. It was in this one, in the facility she had begun volunteering at in December and repairing in January, because the east wall of the main barn had a moisture problem that was going to become structural if left another season. By March, she was effectively managing the facility's daily operations on a schedule that Celestine described as voluntary, and Mara described as something to do in the mornings. She had been doing something to do in the mornings for 11 days when the bus ride happened, and she had been doing it with gradually increasing absorption for 5 months since, which was what home does when you stop arguing with it and allow it to be what it is. She had hung the deployment photo on the wall in her room in February, not folded against the second skeleton in her breast pocket. On the wall, in the light, where Reyes belonged, with his face visible and his name sayable in the open air of a room that kept a fire and made space for him. This was the reordering. This was what it felt like in practice, rather than in theory. It felt like setting something down that had been carried at the wrong height for too long, and feeling the muscles you had been using for that specific purpose. Finally, gradually, release. Funes stopped by the facility on a Friday in May with 2 cups of coffee from the new place that had opened on Ridgemore Road, which was significant because the new place was genuinely good, and he had gone 20 minutes out of his way to get it, and he was not a man who went 20 minutes out of his way without purpose. He gave Celestine 1 cup and gave Mara 1 cup and stood in the lot in the spring light with Ghost at his feet. Ghost had arrived at a position regarding Funes in February that Mara characterized as grudging approval, which for Ghost represented a significant endorsement. And he told them that the state review of the case had formally confirmed that 2 of his prior submitted reports had been deliberately misdirected at the county level. He was vindicated on the record. What he had suspected had been done to his submissions had in fact been done, and this was now part of the confirmed and documented history of the case. He said this in the spring light with the good coffee in his hands, and the expression on his face was not triumph, which is the surface of how people imagine vindication looks. It was something quieter. It was what it looks like when a man who kept showing up is confirmed in the value of the showing up. Mara said, "Good." He said, "Yeah." They drank the coffee in the sunlight. Ghost received a brief scratch behind the ear from Funes and accepted it with the measured grace of a senior official receiving a minor honor that is nonetheless genuinely deserved. What remains in the full accounting is not a list of things made whole, because that is not how this works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is promising a delivery that cannot be made. What remains is a list of things that are different. The dough moves in a corridor now under enhanced state monitoring, with 4 new sensor stations gathering the data that Dr. Nkosi's resumed study needs and that the easement negotiators are already citing in preliminary discussions. The 3 fawns are somewhere in 26,000 acres with their first winter behind them. The smallest moves with the slight asymmetry that Ghost found acceptable and that Mara has come to think of as a kind of signature, the mark that all surviving things carry of what they came through, not as damage, but as record. Garrison Václav is not in prison today, but the case is active, and the evidence is real, and the process is legitimate. Slow is real. The administrative director's cooperation agreement is on file. The County Wildlife Division has a new director who came from the state office, and who called Celestine in her first week to ask what the facility needed, and wrote down what Celestine said, which was a small thing in the way that attentive listening is always described, as a small thing by people who have spent years being met with its absence. Gary Torelli is in a different part of the state. Dr. Nkosi's data grows. The corridor holds its animals. Celestine is still there. Funes is still there. They are not a family in the sense of the word that means something sentimental and arrived at without effort. They are a family in the sense of the word that actually holds up under real conditions, which means people who chose, repeatedly and at some cost and without any guarantee of the outcome, to stay in the same work and to hold each other's weight when the weight became more than one person's share. Ghost is 11 years old and has a gray muzzle that he carries with the dignity of a senior officer who has not received every honor he deserved, but has not let this affect his professionalism. He has a very authoritative opinion about the timing of his morning walk, which he expresses with the economy of language that has characterized his entire career and which is absolutely not subject to negotiation or revision based on weather, operational tempo, or the preferences of his handler. He has decided this posting is where he belongs. He is correct. There is something she has come to believe about the nature of rescue that she could not have said on the November night she stepped off a bus in the rain and followed a dog into the dark. She would not have been ready to say it, even in December, shivering in the facility office over bad coffee with a doe breathing in the next room and a grief folded close against her sternum. She is ready to say it now, in the long spring light, with the timber putting out its new green and the creek running clear over the scoured gravel, and Ghost doing his senior, official morning patrol of the perimeter with the seriousness of a dog who understands the value of the ground he is covering. She says it this way: you cannot tell at the moment of the choice who is being rescued. You can only make the choice and let the answer arrive in its own time, and be willing to be surprised by what it says. She made the choice on a dark road in November because a dog stopped, and because she was a woman who had learned to trust what a dog stopped for. And what the answer has turned out to be is not a completed thing, but an ongoing one, which is the form grace takes when it is the real kind and not the performed kind. The real kind is not a moment. It is a practice. It is a returning. It is a light kept on and a room made available, and a morning you walk through, not because you have resolved everything that aches, but because something is counting on you, and you have finally made peace with letting that be sufficient. The deployment photo is on the wall where Reyes belongs, in the light, with his face visible. She says his name sometimes to Ghost, who has heard it in many registers across many months, and receives it each time with the same quiet authority, the same absence of judgment, the same steady presence that has made him the finest colleague she has ever worked with in any country or any weather or any dark. The name has weight. She has learned to carry weight without hiding it, which is not the same as being free of the weight, but is, she has discovered, a much more livable arrangement. She has stopped counting the days since she spoke to someone who was not a cashier or dispatcher. She is not keeping that count anymore. There are better counts to make. She counts what is living. She counts what is healing. She counts the days. The doze tag pings in the center of the corridor, far from any boundary, moving through the protected land, without avoidance, without the behavioral fear signature that 3 years of data recorded and Dr. Nkosi's reports named, and that the county administration misdirected until it could not be misdirected anymore. The tag pings most days now. She checks most mornings, before the walk and before the coffee and before the first of the day's work finds her. Most mornings the dot is there, deep in the green, moving freely in the place it belongs. This is what protection looks like when it holds. This is what it means for a thing to be genuinely safe. She sees it on the screen and something steady moves through her that is not quite peace and not quite joy, but lives between them in the place that does not have a name yet, the place she has decided she is willing to inhabit, while the name arrives, which she expects to take some time, which is fine because she is not leaving, and the morning is long, and the timber is green, and Ghost is already at the gate waiting for her, with the patience of a dog who understands the value of what is worth waiting for. And the creek is running in the distance, over its clean gravel, and she is here, and she is staying.